Welcome to Hort Culture, where a group of extension professionals and plant people talk about the business, production, and joy of planting seeds and helping them grow. Join us as we explore the culture of horticulture. Welcome, everybody. I'm really excited this week because we are talking about cover crops.
Before we get into all that.
No. Fine. What do you want?
Whatever happened? I thought we were supposed to ease in and talk about stuff and talk about the issues.
The issues are the cover crops.
Whatever happened to when you get a phone call and all of your electronic devices just start going like
oh yeah, the speaker kind of interference.
Whatever happened to that?
I guess they fixed it.
Yeah, I kind of miss it in a way.
I thought you were talking about dial-up. We're on a whole different generation.
Oh yeah.
I was like, get off my modem, Brett. Yeah. I thought you were talking about dial speak. Yeah.
No, I just was thinking about that and how, because like I was imagining receiving a phone call during the podcast and it just like freaked out and it just would feel a little more human. I don't know.
I mean, I can drop things at random or, make my cat meow or something.
One of my favorite things is that I used to pay for ringtones and my phone hasn't been off vibrate in like 10 years now. So.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
That's true.
That's one of my favorite things to think about.
To see everyone in all the meetings we used to attend, everybody would check their phone at the beginning, but now everyone's on silent all the time anyway, so nobody has to check.
Oh, not everybody. Anymore. There's always one.
This is true. Yeah, you are correct.
My parents have started keeping their phones like impossibly loud on the ringer because they're retired, so they don't. They're just trying to answer it.
And sometimes they answer those during meetings.
Yeah, and you hear the whole conversation while you're trying to teach. They don't exit the room.
You gotta set the ringtone to max volume and then the brightness to max brightness.
Flash.
I think when you reach a certain age.
Yeah.
So you look at it, and I mean, like when I pick up a parent's phone, it's like blinding how bright it is.
A sad lamp.
You can get a suntan. That's a suntan. Yeah.
If you ever sit through something that I'm moderating, I will threaten you if your phone goes off.
What else is new?
This is good information because you know what? I'm going to borrow every one of my friends' phones, not tell them, turn them all on, and call them all in succession.
I literally start at the beginning, and I'm like, if I hear your phone go off, you need to get out.
Your band.
Is that my phone going off or Alexis? Which is it?
What? Their phones.
We should call each other during this to see if she'll threaten us to get off.
I have already muted my phone.
I've flushed my phone down the toilet.
This is your warning. Okay.
I just got burned my phone.
There are listeners out there that are like, I feel ya. And there's listeners out there going, oh God, I'm never going to sit through anything she's involved with.
Will County is now county non grata for me.
Oh, I'm all over. You can't escape.
Oh God, Bermuda Triangle.
You can't escape.
She's all over. Oh, I'm afraid now.
It's gonna be everywhere. Oh, I meant to tell you guys, and I haven't yet, so I'm gonna tell you now. On our Hort Culture podcast, you can follow us at Hort Culture Podcast on Instagram. We had a wonderful listener say that she had just started listening to the podcast as a brand new flower farmer in Berea and finding so much value in the episodes. Thank you. Well, thank you. I'm not gonna say this person's name on the podcast just because I don't know if they want to be said on the podcast, but
get called out.
You and we are excited to hear from you guys. So if you ever have any ideas,
if they want to get on the pod, maybe we hit them back and say, hey, we're looking for some new farmer guests or something.
Woo!
I'd recently recorded a very fun little video for so I work with the Center for Crop Diversification group on campus. Me and Josh both do. And it's just about specialty crops in general, marketing and production stuff. But we did a recording about how to use podcasts or how to think about approaching podcasts as a grower. And the things that I highlighted were, I think it can, make you smarter. You can learn some stuff. It can make you feel a little less alone and like part of a broader community. And like you're pulling in the same direction as at least the people that you have those parasocial relationships with through the podcast. Mm-hmm. And the last one I said was, if you have podcasts, especially local ones or ones that are really niche, consider contacting them and seeing if you can get on as a way to like kind of promote your business, but also bring your business into that fold of folks who are pulling in that same direction. And so I think, in general, we like having guests and are thinking about how to structure that. So if there's anybody out there who wants to maybe come on, give us a shout and we'll see if we can work something out.
Podcasting is not nearly as scary as, radio or like anything live. Because number one, we're recording. So if you say a bad word, it's okay. We can edit that out. It's okay. I mean, we don't want to, but we have to. I know it's mostly for me. That was a I'm the problem. It's me. But it's just a fun conversation with your pals or, some other like-minded plant people. So
I could think of some bad words.
Can you?
Malice.
For example, erosion.
Boom. And
Soil,
that's the segue, ladies and
soil
gentlemen.
microbial death. Salinity buildup.
Dirt. That's a bad word. Dirt.
Compaction.
Sorry, Alexis.
Yeah.
Weeds in an open field. And that's what we're trying to combat. These are the bad words that we're trying to wash out of our mouths and everyone else's mouth all across the pod nation. All the true leaves already know.
Expunge them from
For that reason, we're going to be talking about cover crops today.
Yeah.
Is that what we're talking about? Cover crops? Is that the issue of
that was a transition for the ages, ladies and gentlemen. I need you to really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yes, cover crops is
Alexis
what we're
is my
talking
hype
about
woman.
today. Hype, what up? Yeah. So I'm really excited to be talking about them today. So we're going to talk.
To be fair, Alexis and Ray are bouncing in their seats to talk about cover crops.
I'm bouncing because I want to hear Alexis go off on cover crops.
So my ag agent gave me they have a new Ale 8 flavor. It's peach. And so I'm just like, not only are we talking about cover crops, but I'm caffeinated.
Oh, man.
Is the caffeine and sugar.
Caffeine and sugar.
It's like sunshine and happiness.
I can talk about it because it's a Kentucky-made product, so nobody at me for product promotion. Okay, whatever.
Kentucky Brown.
Okay, back to cover crops. So why do we love them? Everybody on this podcast, give me one reason why you love cover crops. Josh, go.
They look cool when they come in.
If you've ever seen Crimson Clover, it's beautiful.
I was going to say, you just took mine. Crimson Clover. It's pretty.
Ray, why do you love cover crops? Go.
Weed suppression.
Weed suppression. Brett?
Sitting and watching a field of buckwheat as the bees dance around, happy as a bee in a buckwheat field.
But have you ever, you guys,
favorite things.
That's your
have you ever had buckwheat honey? Any of you guys?
Yes.
Oh yes.
It's the most unique. I almost liken it to like sorghum, like that dark. Yeah, I love it. Good stuff. But bees love buckwheat, don't they? Yeah, that's a good point, Brett.
Well, it's really hard for me to pick one reason, but I love cover crops because they have some biofumigant issues that they can deal with. So you got some weird nematode issues. You got some weird
Of course. What she likes about it is that it can kill things.
Yes.
Anybody
I like how murderous.
Feel alive when it kills other things. Yes.
For those of you who don't know me, now you do.
It's a biofumigant, so you can kill things.
Are you the same person that made a video? Yeah, sorry, Brad. She made videos of like killing ladybugs. I mean, like.
Oh no, Japanese beetles! I would never.
I'm sorry. I stand
corrected.
Brett was going to interject with his own story
and says, "Yes, kill all of them."
Yeah, I have a video of me putting at the beginning of the season. I the first Japanese beetles I find, I put them on little pikes at the end of my rows. Mm-hmm.
Wow, medieval,
brutal. Yeah,
Lod Lex over here.
Yeah.
So the biofumigant is sort of like your bioweapon against things that you are trying to.
So brassicas, right? They can be used as a biofumigant. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do, but it's very exciting if you get it done right. Not to say I've done it, but I have read a lot about it. So
is it similar to like wasabi and mustard, like the spiciness? Is that the
mustard
same
gas?
Yeah, it's the same kind of similar.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's
sort
literally
of
what they made.
One solution to the problem.
Mustard gas, yes.
It's an old world solution to a modern problem.
Crops. But so we talked. Let's start to talk about, Josh. What was your favorite about cover crops?
I like the way they look.
Like the way they look.
That's what I said.
Okay.
Yeah. I like the way, like, it's a nice thick stand of cover crop is cool.
And in general, you ecology people, I've heard them. I've gone to their gatherings and I've heard them say.
I know some
things like about trying to keep the soil covered. as
Yes.
much as you can. Why do that? Why would you want to do that? And what do you, I mean, and like to keep the soil covered, what do you mean? Like put a tarp on it? I mean, are we talking about something? What are we talking about there?
Well, I mean, it's something that we talk a lot about in bigger agriculture is this concept of crusting, and I'm just looking for a reason to use the word crusting truly. But it kind of relates back to me. One of the things I think, one of the great things is it adds organic matter, which has a lot of benefits in the soil. I mean, yeah, there's lots of other benefits to cover crops, but I kind of start there with this concept of crusting and soil tilth. We sometimes say kind of the talking about the structure of the soil, but organic matter sort of relates to all of that. And when you're dealing with cover crops, you're either leaving it on top of the ground or you're incorporating it. And there's a couple different reasons why you would do that. But yeah, it kind of goes back to organic matter for me. That's one of the great things about cover crops.
When I think of bare ground being a bad thing, a thing that we're trying to avoid and solve with cover crops, bare ground is not a good situation because your soil, it can easily leave your field, right?
Erosion,
And it's
bad
your
word number
valuable,
one.
right? Whether it's wind or rain, and that soil that is leaving. I remember one of the first books I read about agronomy was that the soil that leaves, due to water moving over the surface or wind-blown windstorms, that's your best stuff. And
Yeah.
so you don't want to let it go.
And when it moves around where it's not supposed to be, that's the number one pollutant. We don't typically think of soil as a pollutant, but it's a huge pollutant when it gets in waters and streams and it carries those non-mobile nutrients. When the soil moves, those non-mobile nutrients will move with it. So you get lots of problems with that. We've lost so much topsoil over the past,
Thousands of years.
yeah.
We
Even the last 200 years, 30%
Sure.
of the topsoil, in the U.S. I was
We-
reading in a publication.
I think we also need to start thinking of the soil as something that is alive. So I know we tend to think of soil as just kind of there and it's in,
Cold dead substrate.
it's just something to grow plants in. But it is alive. And by keeping the soil covered, what you're doing is providing homes and food to those valuable, we say microbes a lot. Listen, microbes, fungi, insects, whatever it is.
Microflora and
The
microfauna.
microflora.
And some of the macrofauna.
Yeah.
And some of the
Got a
macro,
nice worm.
A nice worm.
by keeping the soil covered, by having active root growth down in there at is ideal because you're providing them habitat. And those are the things that are going to make nutrients available to your plant, make water available to your plant, air pathways, you name it. We need those things to survive if you're going to grow in a soil media. So that's what I think about from a cover crop perspective is keeping that soil alive, because from and erosion is obviously a bad word and cover crops do help with that. But I can throw a silage tarp over top of my soil and not have any of it blow away with the wind. But what a tarp doesn't do is provide habitat for those fauna and flora that are so valuable to our plant life.
I think another component, this time of year, so we're going to be talking about summer cover crops specifically, but right now we're just in the general cover crop vibe, general cover crop lane, is that this time of year, especially if you move into June, July, you go out and lay down on a bare field in the sun and see how long you want to stick around / can stay alive. That heat can actually be a really detrimental thing to that top layer of life. And we can use that to kind of kill some weed seeds and to our advantage in some cases with solarization and stuff like that. But the cover crops, it's a nice little shady cabana for all those microbes and other stuff to hang out under in the middle of summertime. So, okay, keep it covered. Why don't we just plant back to back to back cover crops year round, keep these things, mow them down, grow it up? We're going back to Great Plains vibe level of fertility in the fields. Why don't we do that? Well, I would
We
say
want to use our soil
money.
for crops. Yes.
Right.
Economics, capitalism. I don't know.
And so keeping the crops covered includes a period where we're growing what we would call a cash crop to differentiate it from a cover crop. That's all. So it's not keep them under cover crops all the time. It's keep something planted there. And we talked about last week a lot about the crop rotation side of things, right? So
Right.
how might, is it just an example to lay it out, how might a cash crop, cover crop rotation look in the course of a year?
The big thing to me is the consideration when you're starting out is when the cash crop is going in or finishing, and that's a lot of that will have to do with whether or not you're planting a cool season cover crop versus like a warm season cover crop. We touched on just a little bit in the last episode of rotating things in and out, where that's going to impact your cover crops and the timing thereof, because certain crops do well in cooler weather and certain crops do well in warmer weather.
So you think of cover crops as part of the rotation. Is that
Part of
right?
the rotation, and timing is important there, uh, because then that's going to determine if you are putting in a cover crop, from one of the many reasons that we just discussed. It's going to impact that. Yeah. When your cash crops are there, and then when they're not there, your cover crops are.
So why, going back to I think like what you were originally getting at, Brett, why don't we, okay, if the goal is to have plants growing in an area, why don't we do cash crop after cash crop? Because we've got plants growing in that area. So why would you incorporate a cover crop? Well, one reason would be because you're probably, a lot of us are not growing. There's some people, there's just some really impressive, intensive people out there that are growing year round in an area. If you've got a high tunnel or something like that, you're going to go in maybe with tomatoes, you're going to go back in with your lettuces. You've kind of constantly got something going in there. But I think for most people, they're going to have an off season. So one thing is that you might not want to be growing or outside picking or weeding or doing whatever it is in, February or November when it's just gross outside. So if you have, you can put in a cover crop just to cover the soil and to help with your those winter weeds that we get a lot. But another reason is going to be nutrients, from a
Mm-hmm.
nutrient standpoint. So when you are putting in a cash crop, you are constantly removing nutrients from the soil because those nutrients are going up into those tomatoes, up into those beans, into the leaf lettuce,
And
whatever
then
it
into
is,
my belly.
and then into your belly. Exactly. So you're mining the nutrients from the soil. What a cover crop has the ability to do is to put nutrients back into the soil, and again, help those microbes, get through that process. The plant is usually staying in a little bit longer depending on the type, but you're typically incorporating them back into the soil. At the same time, you're benefiting from the weed suppression that you're going to get. And then you're rotating, hopefully, if you're doing it right, you're rotating those families. So you're breaking the disease and insect cycle that could be there.
So you mentioned nitrogen, Alexis, which we had just a discussion on the side. It's the one element that's usually, typically, most limiting, needed in the greatest quantity, but it's the most mobile in plant systems. Some plant systems, after the plants are produced, you either have less nitrogen than you started with, or you have more. You have an excess of nitrogen, and that also has a big impact on your cover crops. Some cover crops you would plant because you don't want that nitrogen to go anywhere. You want to sequester that into biomass.
Mm-hmm.
Because nitrogen is like all the other nutrients. When we talked about soil erosion, if that soil were to erode, you're not capturing that nitrogen. So that's a big consideration to me is what's the state of nitrogen after your production of whatever crop. And I think about home gardeners here. I mean, yes, it has a huge impact, especially on commercial producers, but home gardeners year in and year out, they, ask about cover crops. Well, I know that most home gardeners, the nitrogen is so high, the phosphorus and potassium in their soils, particularly, and the nitrogen probably is too. It's very high in their soil, and I usually recommend a cover crop that's going to take in nitrogen, not a legume that's going to produce nitrogen, uh, through the legume itself. So that's a big deal to me is the state of nitrogen after a crop. That's going to really steer me into what sort of cover crop I'm going to get involved with, because it's all about nitrogen to me. Not only the nitrogen that's in your soil, but the carbon nitrogen ratio of the cover crop after you're done with it, whether or not I'm going to just lay it on top of the soil through whatever means, or I'm going to incorporate it. All of that's really important.
And the flip side, so I grow in a high tunnel, and I have a lot of experience with high tunnels. You can, when I said plants, no matter what you're growing, can mine nutrients, and with cover crops, you can help incorporate those back in instead of ripping it all out. If you're in a high tunnel setting, a lot of the time we have heavy salinity, or a lot of
Mm.
soils in Kentucky have, in general, have high phosphorus. Sometimes those levels can be so high that they make other nutrients, make it hard for plants to take up other nutrients, so the ratios get off. And what people can use cover crops for is actually to pull some of those. So some cover crops are really good at mining phosphorus. As an example, some floral cover crops, especially because flowers need a lot of phosphorus to bloom. So they will pull a lot of phosphorus out of the soil. And then instead of incorporating them, they will actually put those somewhere else. So they're either get rid of them, burn them, or they will incorporate them in a place maybe that has low nutrient levels. So in that way, they can kind of be used to actually mine that. And then they might go in with, something like a lettuce that's a low feeder as far as how much nutrients they need. They're real chill. It's like feeding a baby versus feeding a football player. When a football player is a tomato, and a small 2-year-old is going to be a lettuce as far as how much they're going to ingest. But yeah, plants can do a lot. I mean, our organic growers especially really depend on cover crops for nutrient management. So, I was reading to kind of prepare my brain with some facts for the pod, and they did a study here in Kentucky that said that hairy vetch as a cover crop produces equivalent of 67 pounds per acre of nitrogen fertilizer. So it's not like small potatoes. I mean, corn needs a lot if you're going in with corn,
No,
but
it's
if you're,
actually a legume, not a
it's
potato at all.
actually a small bean.
They're like tiny
It's a
potatoes.
large bean. 67 pounds per acre can be
Big
pretty
bean.
significant for something to cover crop. And then that's just the nitrogen. We're not talking about the fact that it, helped those microbes out. We're going to incorporate something to produce more organic matter. So our soil tilth in general, the physical characteristics of it are better. But now we also have our nutrients added into that.
Yeah, so I've found that what I need is the love and support of friends to bloom in my personal life. So in that way, you guys are my nutrient.
We're your marigolds. That's what they
And I'm good at mining it. Like, I'm not
We're
that
going to
good.
call ourselves the NPK bunch.
That's right.
We're
Oh, who's who? That's a good question.
We're here in macro amounts.
I'm just
for
your
you,
little
man.
daisy.
Yeah, or huckleberry. How about
Well, so
that?
if we could, maybe let's go from broad into specifics and talk. So we're right now getting ready to head into the summer-ish season. Alexis, you mentioned multiple. I think all of us have mentioned that the winter off season is kind of the most mainstream thought about cover crops because it's in between. Even a lot of big commodity growers grow a winter wheat or a winter rye in between their commodity seasons. From that like October, November window up through planting. Ahead of in April, but right now we're headed into the summer season, and so maybe we're talking about all these categories, and we're talking about nitrogen fixation and sequestration and all these other fancy little words that we're bringing up here. Can we just jump into a couple of specifics of types of summer cover crops and how you might use them? Because I think one thing that we didn't quite mention is that there are times where within a cash crop rotation, you will just have a window where you can't get something else in a productive way, another cash crop into that rotation in a productive way. And cover crops can fill that gap. That would be something like buckwheat, maybe a short turnaround. But as far as when we think about summer cover crops, what are some of the big ones that come to mind? We might reference some materials here because there's a handful of them. But what are we thinking about? And if you had to summarize, if we're thinking about those categories, what does that thing do?
I guess we could think about it in terms of Alexis, Josh, non-legumes and legumes. That's what I
Yeah,
usually
that's
start.
how I
Yeah,
would think of it.
break
Yeah.
break it down. Yeah, and there's some in each category, I
So a
suppose.
legume is like the bean family.
Nitrogen
These are the things
fixers.
that
Yeah, beans and
fix
peas.
nitrogen
Yeah.
through their. And let's give a shout out to the rhizobia for being the real OGs who are doing it. They have I dabble in the science arts, but correct me if I'm wrong. They have these little colonies, these little clusters on their
Little
roots
nodules.
of the legumes that are actually the hardworking microbes that are doing that nitrogen fixation. And so, as you said, Ray, you could put those in take a soil test before and after, and maybe have more nitrogen after you planted it than
Yeah.
before.
And that may be desired, not always though. And
Yeah.
we've already touched on that. It depends on what your objectives are. And the organic gardeners seem to have a lot of times a really good handle on this small and large scale production, because they take these things into consideration, because the limitations within their systems or the confines that they work in. But yeah, the legumes a lot of times will have a kind of a net gain of nitrogen, whether through them making nitrogen, or the fact that a lot of them are more succulent and they break down and then release additional, through different processes, additional nitrogen there. But yeah, that could be kind of a net gain, but
And so
that's sort of
in
the category.
summertime, what are those that category? What are some of them that we're looking at?
We were kind of throwing some things out there. Cowpea is one that I like. That's a summer legume. I've seen that used some. There's
Alf,
some others. I've even seen things like a soybean. I mean, that we don't
Yeah.
often we don't think of it. I mean, if you guys familiar with that, I have some producers that actually
I've heard of
use.
soybeans. Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, it's kind of a world crop. I guess we should reference that. And yeah, the soybean, it's kind of an important little guy. It's kind of an important little guy. But I guess in the conversation here, it's used a little bit different
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna
as a
cheat.
cover crop.
I'm
Yeah,
gonna cheat here and read off. So
is there some
alfalfa,
stats?
crimson clover, and sweet clover are some of the nitrogen fixtures that I think
Yeah,
about
the
as
clovers.
the clovers.
I
Mhm.
generally don't. I mean, they can be used as a summer cover crop. I generally
Cool.
don't necessarily think of them that way. Usually
Hmm.
crimson clover, we're starting to terminate by now.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So if you go
And that's
back,
a challenge, is timing. Yeah, that's a great point,
I
Alexis.
think
That's the challenge.
I think when you think about cover crops, the number one thing, and you're using them in rotation. So first, how can I rotate outside of a family? All right, we've already talked about that with rotation. Next is, what do I want it to do for me, and how much effort do I want to put
Mm.
into it? And so I say that because we talk about the cowpea as an example. So what do I want it to do for me? Well, I want it to give me biomass, which is pretty standard for most of your cover crops, but I also want it to fix nitrogen. Okay, so I know I'm going to look into a legume. The cowpea does well in droughty conditions. So
Tap rooted,
if
yeah.
I'm putting it in, right, because it has a taproot. So if I'm putting it in more in summer when we're, in Kentucky, I'd like to, I don't know, Kentucky weather's crazy, but in theory, July, you're not going to have as much rain. And I don't want to have to irrigate my cover crop. I might go with the cowpea because that's something, and it's going to produce a lot of biomass. So if I really need to build my organic matter in my soil, I can do something like a cowpea. But you need to think about how you're going to terminate the cover crop.
Oh, the
That's the
regrowth is a
that's
problem.
the
Yeah.
third part of this. So I need
Yeah.
to think about what it's going to do for me, how much I want to manage it, but also termination and time, timing that termination correctly, I think is really important.
Yeah. So before we jump into that, maybe we can explore that for each of these. So the
Mm-hmm.
other big category we said was non-legumes.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of
Mhm.
times, typically we think of grasses.
Yeah.
So the classic ones I think of are sorghum Sudan grass and Sudan grass, but also some of the millets, different
Mm-hmm.
millets. These are the
Yeah.
warmer season grasses that, in the case of sorghum Sudan grass, it has no ability to handle our winters or even our early falls.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be terminated by that
And
cold
I
and
like
kill.
that. And that one, like sorghum Sudan, is a good companion. Actually, if you want to mix it in with what Alexis was just talking about, it's a good companion for some of these things that can be blended in with some of the legumes. If you've got a handle on the termination process, which Brett, like you said, that one terminates kind of the weather terminates it. So
So
that's a
when you're
good
thinking
point.
about sorghum Sudan, it's a very popular one. It produces, again, a large amount of biomass, which means it gets big. So you've
Mhm.
got to have a way to terminate it, because you're not going to do it, or I wouldn't recommend you do it by hand.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people will mow this more than one time in the
Mhm.
season so that they can have a better handle, because it will get,
In other words,
10,
don't let it get tall
10 to
in the
12
first
foot
And if you
place.
tall.
mow it, it produces even more biomass. That's a great
Right.
side effect of that. Yeah,
Right.
that's
It
awesome.
also has weed suppression. So it has what's called allelopathy traits to it. So essentially those roots, if you've ever heard of like
Black
walnut
walnut.
wilt,
Yeah.
black walnut. So black walnut has a allelopathy toxin in the root system called juglone, and essentially things like tomatoes are very sensitive to them, and they just won't grow. And that's how black walnuts keep themselves from being crowded by something else. Sorghum Sudan grass is great for that. So if you have an area that you've got heavy weed pressure and you really want to try and deal with that, you can go in with something like that. We talked about buckwheat. I feel like we need to give buckwheat more credit. We've only barely mentioned her.
It's a good one. It's a
Number
really
one,
good one.
she's great for pollinators. So if you are trying to attract more pollinators, or if you're a beekeeper, buckwheat is a really great one. The biggest reason I love buckwheat is because it's so quick. So when you're trying to work crops in, you can put buckwheat in and it's flowering in 4 to 6 weeks. And if you need to terminate it before then, it still has lots of biomass on it. So if
Just-
you need something that you can terminate within a month, buckwheat is a really good way to
Just
go.
don't let it go to seed.
Don't let it
not.
go to seed. And it's easy to terminate. So you can do this by mowing it. I've used a weed eater on it. You can also just drag yourself a tarp over top of it and smother it. Now, again,
It's
Small enough you can
frost
you could
sensitive,
step on
you
it
could step
really hard
on it.
and
Yeah.
it'll crunch. It almost has like a
It's-
succulent kind of feel.
Yeah.
And it's a great phosphorus scavenger. So if you're needing to either, maybe you've got phosphorus and you've been having to add your phosphorus, it will go scavenge for it, bring it up into the root system, into that area, and then it'll be right there in that root zone when you go in with another one of your plants. And so that's one good thing that it does for you.
So I thought that Juglone was a fan of the Insane Clown Posse.
It may
Common
be.
misconception.
Maybe that's the
Both has
etymological origin.
toxicity.
Juggalo, aren't those?
Oh, that's what I was thinking of. So
Mispronunciation.
if I could just dig a little deeper on this thing that Alexis has said several times now, this idea of biomass. It puts on a lot of biomass. And so some people may be like, yeah, I know what that means. But in general, what we're thinking of is it takes minerals and nutrients from the soil. It through the magical processes that plants go through, it takes and stores them and uses those to build itself up over the course of its growing season. So it's taking things that might typically wash out the bottom of your soil profile. They may get used by weeds. They may get blown away if the root mass weren't there. It takes them and it stores them in its physical being in this big, juicy, leafy biomass thing, this beautiful, luscious mound. And the thing that's cool about that, again, is it ties it up. It takes that stuff that's there that you've either applied as fertilizer, you've built it up through nitrogen fixation, or maybe it was just there already in the soil because you have really great soil. And in the events where you have heavy rainfall or whatever, it's tied up physically in that plant. And then when you go to terminate it, all of that juicy, lovely nitrogen and carbon that was tied and other nutrients that were tied up in that plant, when it dies, it you fall down, if leave it there, you mulch it, you do whatever you're going to do to or turn it into, cut it up so that it's really finely chopped up and let it decompose. Think of that as the sponge got filled up with all this nutrients. And then when that happens, you squeeze that sponge full of nutrients out just in time for your cash crop to soak it all up. Ideal world.
Keep in mind, if we're talking about some, you mentioned carbon nitrogen. If it's something like sorghum Sudan grass, which it has a high carbon profile, which means there's a net loss of nitrogen in the soil because it takes nitrogen. Yeah, 10-to-1 is an ideal ratio, roughly, when we're talking about the decomposition process. But it's 50-to-1. So not only does it take the available nitrogen in that plant to break itself down, but it also has to use soil nitrogen to also break that down. So that's a real important concept, that you have a kind of there for a while, you have a net loss.
And you're talking about after you've cut it down.
Yes, and it
just
starts to break down.
like your compost pile needs green and brown items in it. It's actually going to steal some of the green items from the soil for a little while. And so that brings us back to that planning out termination that Alexis, you were kind of getting at, is so you got a lot of biomass to deal with. In other words, you might clog up your mower, you might pull out your back trying to do it by hand. Yeah, that's what happened to me. And
sorghum Sudan grass, sun hemp. I'm sorry,
baldness. And so, Alexis, on the termination side, in addition to the biomass, you have to think about that timing component too, right?
Right. So the more, we said buckwheat's like kind of a very like succulent, just, you can kind of squash those leaves really easily and get it's a juicy plant. It's juicy, right?
Juicy.
It's juicy.
Want that on a t-shirt? Buckwheat for
Buckwheat.
life.
So it's going to decompose quickly. So not only is it a quick crop, but in the hot summer, which is what we're usually talking about when we're talking about summer cover crops, once you chop that up, and the finer the pieces are, the faster it's going to decompose. So the more succulent a cover crop is, the faster it's going to decompose. So if you can turn it under or cover it with a tarp, if you're doing like a no-till type system, and let it heat up, and with plenty of moisture underneath there, so you may have to even like give it a little sprinkle or wait till after a rain or something. But if you let it heat up, it's going to decompose. You're probably looking at 10 to 14 days in an ideal situation. If you're doing something that is a lot drier with a lot of that biomass, like sorghum Sudan grass, for those of you who don't know that, kind of think of corn, but even on more steroids.
Yeah.
Gives you kind of an idea. It's a woodier type texture.
If corn is Vin Diesel, so sorghum Sudan grass is The Rock.
The Rock, yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Oh, now it's on.
Now
Gone
everybody's like,
Batista,
I get you.
but
Yeah.
okay.
Beware of anything on the label that says grows anywhere between 4 to 12 feet tall. That's a wide range fit, folks.
Yeah, so that's going to take
It's
a
very
longer
big. It's a
period
big
of
grass.
time.
Yeah.
You're probably going to want to till that one in. So you're going to break it down with something, a bush hog or a flail mower.
And it will bind your bush hog or mechanical rotary style. We talked to, the flail mower. We talked about, it takes sometimes a special cutter. If you let these things get big, you will be frustrated if you just have like a riding mower and a small plot and you're used to mowing down your beautiful crimson clover. You will get frustrated if you have 8 foot of sun hemp or sorghum Sudan and try to mow that. It's going to bind all of your equipment, your tillage equipment, your mowing equipment, everything.
Just to read between the lines, if you don't have a good mechanism for taking this stuff down, you may want to stay away from sorghum Sudan grass as an option.
Or sun hemp.
Or mow it on a continuous basis.
Yeah.
It's one of
Keep
some
it
of these
short.
things that they'll come back and, it'll kind of regrow to an extent. So, yeah.
So going back to timelines, thinking about timing. So maybe I rip out, I'm going to use flowers because that's what I know a good rotation for. You might go in with some cool flowers. Cool flowers are all the hype right now, literally and figuratively. So those are actually planted in the fall. They overwinter, and then you're harvesting them starting probably early in our area of the state, early April through right now.
Can you give me a couple of examples of those species?
Orlea, agrostema, ranunculus, anemone.
I'm not sure which language she just yelled at us in, but I'm not sure.
Campanula,
What did you
lark,
call me?
Long and prosper.
I called you an agrostema. Actually, agrostema's common name is called corn cockle, which I don't like.
Is this the juggalo language that you're speaking?
Juglone.
Juglone.
So anyway, you're planting them in the fall. They're overwintering. So a vegetable version of this might be lettuce or kale, Swiss chard, something like that. So you're overwintering it. You're going to harvest it until it gets too hot. And so in lettuce world and those things, we call that bolting. In flower world, we just say that's going to seed. It means the exact same thing. It's just different terminology. So we're about to hit that period in central Kentucky here over the next week or two because we're getting in the 80s and those plants are unhappy. So you can pull that out, and some people will go right back in with a summer annual, or you can put in a quick cover crop. And so you could put in something like buckwheat. You have let's call it a month just for some easy math. So in June, it goes in. It's in all the way through June, and then I'm going to terminate it. And by mid-July, I can have a second succession of summer annuals going in. So I can put in a zinnia, I can put in celosia, some of those fast things, or I can put in another cover crop if I want to, and then wait until fall to plant some more cool crops. What that does is give you flexibility. So you can go in with a cover crop, if you're not ready, because sometimes you're just not ready. You're busy harvesting. If you're a business, you're harvesting, you're marketing. You're just not always ready to go back in, amend the soil, till or add compost, put any plastic back down, trellis, all of those things that go into putting a new crop in. Sometimes you don't have time, but we don't want to leave that soil bare. So we put in a cover crop, we suppress the weeds, we help the soil in between. And then when you have the ability mentally and physically to go back in with a crop, you can go back in and know that you're not going to, have as many problems, and you are doing something good for your business, for your, crop, for your soil in the meantime.
Yeah, I think another application of the buckwheat you were talking about is like if you put in your first planting of tomatoes and some deer came in and wiped them out, or there's a hailstorm, or some blight just pops off like never before, and you have suddenly this, you got to pull them out. They're not going to do anything. It's nice to have that on hand as a bridge crop to be able to make that happen on short notice. And it's a nice way to get a cover crop in that short window that maybe you want to do that, you for one reason or another, you want some biomass and some food for those microbes. And but it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like some of the longer season stuff would require a little more planning in order
Yeah,
to fit that in. Like it's got to be kind of a part of your rotation that you're anticipating, and
right.
you know how long it's going to go. And
That's what I talked about, like on our um, crop rotation section, where what I'm doing is I have actual plots that are going to stay in a cover crop for a longer period of time, and I've divided up and know that I can sell, a certain area worth of flowers or veggies or whatever it is, and then I have this third area that's going to be in a cover crop, and I'm just going to move those around every year so that every 3 years we're getting a new cover crop in there. So you can work it in that way. If you don't necessarily want to work it in between your cash crops, you can work it in between your plots. You can think of it as your cover crop plot.
so the termination on stuff like grasses, for instance, we're trying to do that before they go to seed, right?
Oh, yes. You will
Seed
hate
is
yourself
bad.
if you
Yeah,
don't.
seed's bad.
Yeah.
Can you just say a little bit more about that? Because there's a certain window of time where, like, right, if we take it out at that time, it's less likely to grow back because it's sort of committed to going toward seed, but it hasn't formed seed yet. This is at least coming out of winter. That's been
Kind of a time period where you're getting maximum biomass, and usually have to know a little bit about the plant, look for the bloom period, because some of these things bloom like buckwheat, and you can base the cut off of that. So you have to know a little bit about the biology of the plant. But yeah, you kind of watch the plant. You want to, in many cases, you want it to make all that biomass if you have a way to terminate it, mow it, and deal with that. And that's in your plan to make all of that, the green tops,
Mhm.
to make all the good stuff. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Like Ray was saying, it's not just about preventing it from reseeding and planting when you don't want it to. It's about the plant's physiology and where it's putting its energy. Right up until it seeds, it's putting a lot into vegetative growth, and that's what's giving us what we want. Once it starts going to seed, it's putting its energy into seed formation, and it's going to be a lot harder to kind of get those nutrients back out.
Yeah. And we're on the topic today. You guys mentioned earlier, a couple of you guys were talking about some really cool tools that are fairly new through the university. Anybody want to speak a little bit more about
Well,
those?
before we go into those specifically, I do work very closely with the Southern Sustainable Ag Research and Education Program. That's Southern SARE, which is a part of USDA SARE. It's a national program interested in sustainable agriculture. And I would say one of their bread and butter topics across the last 30 years has been cover crops and the use of cover crops because of interest. It's of interest to really anyone from the home gardener scale all the way up to a 30,000 acre, 100,000 acre row crop farm and everything in between. And so there's a lot of resources available from them. There's a couple of books. You can download everything that they have for free. It's one that's called Managing Cover Crops for Profit. There's stuff about using cover crops as part of a strategy for attracting pollinators and giving habitat for beneficial insects and other folks like that. And they also, and I'll briefly mention too, there's a group called there's a Southern Cover Crops Council. I don't know that they've come out with a guide just yet, but there's also a Midwest Cover Crops Council. And they've come out with a really nice summary, short, it's a pocket guide, but you can actually download the digital version of that as well just to give you a sense of what some of the crops are, what the planting windows are, and all that kind of fun stuff. So there are some resources out there. I would encourage you to go to the SARE website, and we'll also post the link to the cover crops guide as well, as to get as a nice starting point and orientation point. And we will be talking about cover crops again in the future for sure. We kind of wanted to do the primer and the summer stuff, but Josh, you've been working on something that made Alexis go, "Ooh, this is so cool."
So exciting.
Yeah, that was exciting to hear. Yeah, I've been working with the Hort Council, Kentucky Horticulture Council, to develop a cover crop calculator. Essentially, it's available now. We'll put a link with the distribution material for this episode, but it's primarily targeting people who are working with management areas that are smaller than an acre. Now, you could have a multi-acre farm, but maybe you're just worried about managing a bed that's only 1,000 square feet or 1,600 or something like that. And you can use this to calculate kind of a high and low seeding rate for a variety of cover crops in Kentucky, whether they're legumes, non-legumes, like we talked about, for scavenging nutrients, as well as we have brassicas in there as well for those of you who are excited about biofumigants and terrorizing the nematodes on your farm. And there's additional resources there as well. There's a link to SARE publications and things like that for more details. But it's a small, or it's a simple kind of mobile responsive tool that you can pull up on your phone or your tablet or your computer and just do some quick calculations about what you'll need for seeding with cover crops.
That made me imagine a movie where the president of the nematodes very angrily says, "We do not negotiate with brassicas." I don't know
As a
why.
general policy.
Like, it kind of had like a Danny Glover as president, from a disaster movie energy, and so I just wanted to share that with
There's a
everyone.
hard line
Right,
being
right.
drawn here. A hard line.
Oh,
Sounds like a great tool. I'm excited to check that out.
and there are some, I'm jumping in here and saying that there are some specifically for high tunnels. So a lot of time you're working in a smaller space. So the type of termination you do could be different, but also what you need, what your goals are for those cover crops are often different because you're working in a structure that there's no rain getting into. So I'd recommend checking those out, and they have that for both cool season and warm season. So if you have to have your tomato cover crop, but maybe you don't do a ton with it in the winter, you can do a cover crop then, or vice versa. Depending on that, and that can help you, especially if you're having any salinity issues going on. Cover crops can be a good resolution or part of
And
a
if
resolution.
if you're listening to this and you want to use a cover crop maybe to establish a field or get some biomass on the field ahead of maybe starting next season to work there or whatever, if you're in any way evaluating right now, so depending on when you're listening to this, that in where we are, generally speaking, the April, May through July window is it. You could probably find some sort of cover crop to put in
Mhm.
during that time period. And what we'll do is we'll revisit this probably several times over the course of time, but we'll also cover things like the fall considerations and give a little bit of a heads up on when you might think about seeding that kind of stuff in the future. But just in general, if you're coming away from this like, yeah, all this stuff about summer cover crops is great, but I'm listening to this June 13th, is it too late? Well, no, it's not. It's not too late, and you can generally figure something out maybe for this year, if not for next year.
Buckwheat's always the answer.
Mm-hmm. It's never too late for cover crops.
Russia is the number one global producer of buckwheat.
I
Wow.
did not know that. Oh, that
Yeah,
well, yeah, you can make like
shout
buckwheat
out
flour, right?
shout out Soba. I love Soba. There's a really really good. It might be. I'm trying to think of what. There's a YouTube video. One of those. It's not up on Appetit, but it's in that kind of vein. But it's a really cool video of this dude making traditional soba
Mm.
noodles. And the thing that's tricky, so buckwheat doesn't have gluten in it.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
So it doesn't want to stick together. It's like trying to build, out of a pasta out of sand almost. And so it's this old, like traditional Japanese technique of like mixing it and being really delicate, and it takes all this time, and then you get to the end and you can mess it up. But to save you the spoiler, he does not mess it up. It's really cool. It's
Bummer.
on YouTube. Yeah, soba. Sorry, I'm a buckwheat.
Somehow I thought you
I'm
were
a
going
bit
to
of a
add lard
buckwheat
to
boy.
that,
I
Brett,
like
and
this.
you're going to add lard to stick it together. I mean, I was waiting for it, and it didn't happen.
No,
I was
just
very let
just
down.
just water. I think it's just
Wow.
water and buckwheat flour, and
Huh.
Sounds more delicate than I would be able to work with. I mean, that's too delicate.
too delicate. That's why you get
Yeah.
him to do it for you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
The
I'm a
experts.
bit of a buckwheat boy.
Bit of a YouTuber, it sounds like.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
Consumption and production.
But
Josh, can you save us from whatever I'm talking about
I
right now?
will try. But yeah, to go ahead and kind of conclude what we talked about today with cover crops is, it's important to know what to seed. What cover crop are you using? Are you trying to just cycle the nutrients that are there and available? Are you trying to fix nitrogen? Are you trying to murder a class of microbes like Alexis always seems to be doing? And then from that, figure out when you are going to be seeding and when, and very importantly, how you are going to be terminating that when it's done, because that is a crucial thing to understand before you put stuff in the ground. Is how are you going to kill it before it does
takes
something
over.
you don't want it to do. And yeah, we have some new tools for this stuff. There's a lot of publications about cover cropping and what cover crops can do for you in different kind of contexts, different times around the year. And be sure to check out the cover crop calculator.
Yeah,
I'm proud of it.
I'm
And
looking at it
if
right
you're a
now.
major computer nerd, you can look at the source code itself and see how it works and adapt it to however you want.
open source king.
Yes.
And one thing we didn't mention, there are a wide variety of ways to seed these cover crops,
Mm.
including very low tech, as walking around in the field with a bag or with one of the a belly, I call it a belly grinder, like a
Oh yeah.
thing that you crank to put it out, or a lawn seeder, stuff like
Mhm.
that, all the way up to vacuum seeders and all kinds of other crazy stuff. So don't let that technological thing get in your way, because you
Works for small and large scale.
I've
Yeah.
done mine by hand. I'm not saying it's done that well, but it gets the job done.
It's artisan.
Hand casting is a lost art.
So, anyways, we hope that as we grow this podcast, you will grow with us. And we are excited. Like I said, join us on Instagram. Follow us at Hort Culture Podcast. Please feel free to leave us any of your recommendations. If there's something you want to learn about, hear about, we are open to that. Otherwise, you're just going to hear all the crazy soba noodle stories that we're going to come up with. So, anyways, thank you for listening, and we will talk to you next time.